Alright guys, so last night we got the official results from the Democratic and Republican primaries up in Michigan. And so on the Republican side of this, I don't really know how much I have to say about it. Donald Trump convincingly defeated Nikki Haley once again. The spread here was 68.1% to 26.6%, 12-4 delegate split. Donald Trump did slightly underperform what the polling was suggesting that he would get in this race, but I think that this has been wrapped up for a while now, unless Trump just randomly, drops dead from a stroke or something like that. Now, moving on to the Democratic primary, which I think is much more interesting, right? So I talked about a couple weeks ago how there was this movement to select uncommitted instead of Joe Biden or even some of these other candidates as well, Marianne and Dean Phillips, in a protest against Joe Biden's endless support for Israel's genocidal war on the people of Gaza. And the group that was organizing this effort to vote uncommitted was aiming for roughly around 10,000 votes. Now, granted, that's a pretty low bar, but not only did they clear that low bar, they absolutely blew it out of the water, getting up to 101,000 votes as we currently stand right now. 101,000 votes for uncommitted. These are people who showed up to the polls, went out of their way to go and vote in this primary that they knew was going to result in Joe Biden winning at the end of the day, but still went to go and make their voices heard. Okay? 101,000. Now keep in mind, guys, the split of Joe Biden winning Michigan in 2020, right? Keeping in mind that in 2024, this is a state he basically has to win. But in 2020, he only won by 150,000 votes against Trump. So you have 100,000 people who are clearly dedicated Democratic Party supporters, typically, right? That they showed up to vote in this primary. And you have 101,000 of them who are voting uncommitted to protest your Israel policy. So you're already cutting the margin from 2020 by a wide margin. It's incredibly slim. And then you're assuming that Joe Biden doesn't lose any other voters for any other reason. Now, Israel and Gaza is obviously a very big issue for him, especially in a state like Michigan, but it's not the only one. He has issues with people's view on his handling of the economy and immigration and his age and senility and things like that. So there are a whole bunch of different reasons why he may lose votes in a swing state like Michigan. This is just one of them, and 100,000 people showed up to voice their concerns with his Israel policy, right? 101,000. Absolutely astounding. Now, not everybody agrees with my analysis here, that this is a big deal for him in November, and we're going to get to some of the coping and some of the delusional denial of what this means from some of the most loyal Democratic foot soldiers here in a bit, with Nina Turner going on CNN and being attacked by the rest of this panel that was in place for even bringing up the suffering in Gaza as part of her analysis of why this happened. So that was absolutely insane. But a couple other things that I wanted to bring up here. I mean, as pointed out by Prem Thacker, the final results from Dearborn, Michigan, which is the predominant, Arab American, populated county within Michigan, the uncommitted vote straight up defeated Joe Biden, almost 57% to about 40% here, with uncommitted beating Joe Biden. That's absolutely insane, guys. That is totally insane. And so I want to also make the point that it wasn't just predominantly Arab American, counties or districts that voted for uncommitted. You can look at the breakdown here, guys. There was almost no county in the entirety of the state that got below 9, 10, 11, 12% voting for uncommitted here. So, I mean, listen, you could look at this and you could say, look, Joe Biden, he got 81.1%. That's an overwhelming victory. He did phenomenally well. This is no issue. Okay, hate to break it to people, but 101,000 people in a very close swing state that, by the way, he's already, according to the polling data for November, on track to lose to Donald Trump. This is not a good sign. It's not a neutral sign. It is a bad sign for Joe Biden. It is a disastrous sign for Joe Biden. And you can look at all of the different counties that are not predominantly Arab American, and there were thousands and thousands of people who were voting uncommitted. Not just Arab Americans, white Americans, black Americans, Hispanic Americans, everybody of any given sort, right? Young Americans predominantly were showing up to make their voices heard on this. Another thing that was pointed out here by Abdullah, who I believe is the mayor of Dearborn, he said that he was talking to people on the ground, And he said that some of them opted to do a write-in for ceasefire or free Palestine. Some opted for a nonpartisan ballot and skipped the presidential primary question. Some voted for another Democratic primary candidate, right? Marianne or Dean Phillips. And many are voting uncommitted. So even this uncommitted number of 101,000, that's not even the total. Because again, you had people who were writing in other things, ceasefire or free Palestine. You had some people who were voting for Marianne Williamson as a protest vote or Dean Phillips as a protest vote. Them together, that makes up another additional 42,000 on top of this 100,000 that were voting against Biden. And then on top of that, none of these numbers include the amount of people who just stayed home, which is really Joe Biden's biggest issue. His issue is not that people are going to flip to Donald Trump. His issue is that a large amount of people are just going to stay home. And it doesn't take that much, a couple 10,000 here and there in some of these close swing states, and that's it. He loses the 2024 election. It's that simple. They could stay home or they could vote for third party. That's the threat to Joe Biden. And yet you have basically a complete delusional analysis here for many prominent Democrats. So we're going to get to that here. I just wanted to mention real quick, Joe Biden's statement after the Michigan primary took place. Now, I'm not going to read all of this. I won't subject you guys to that. But, you can pause it if you want to read the entire thing. He mentions things like MAGA extremism, and down here he mentions abortion. He also mentions the UAW and workers and wages and benefits. He mentions prescription drugs. He mentions the auto industry. He mentions infrastructure. He mentions everything except for the main issue that was on the ballot outside of himself as an individual in Michigan, which is his support for Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. He does not even mention that in this statement. Think about how crazy that is. 13% just voted uncommitted, 100,000 people who he needs to win in November, and he doesn't even mention it. He doesn't even give them a platitude or a virtue signal. It's just nothing. There's nothing here about Israel or Gaza, right? So that was absolutely insane. Now, I did have to mention this just real quick. I don't know if this is the case. I'm not going to say 100% one way or another, but I thought it was worth bringing up. Obviously, earlier in the week, I think it was yesterday, I did a video where I talked about Joe Biden promising a ceasefire by next Monday. He said that's when he thinks a ceasefire would go into place with all of this backroom negotiations that he has been doing with Israel and Qatar and the rest of that. And he said next Monday there's probably going to be a ceasefire. And this person points out, Afif here says that Biden flippantly lied about a potential ceasefire deal to influence Michigan's primary results, knowing that this uncommitted vote had a substantial movement behind it, and that there's a substantial, Arab American population in Michigan, in places like Dearborn especially, and Wayne County in Michigan. So I don't know, guys. I mean, you guys tell me. Did he do this on purpose? Or was this just him, showing a senile side of himself in that moment? Was he just pulling this out of his ass? Was he lying about it? Does he not know what the updated status is of a potential ceasefire deal? Because remember, yesterday, okay, when he made this statement, or 2 days ago when he made this statement, it was basically immediately contradicted by Israel and Hamas, the two main parties to this supposed ceasefire deal. It was immediately contradicted by them. So where did he get the idea that a ceasefire was coming on Monday from? Where did he get that idea? It seems like he just completely made it up. Why did he do that? I don't know. Now, another thing that I thought was worth responding to here is one of the main responses that I was getting after I posted, some tweets here about the uncommitted vote and what my analysis of it was. So this person points out this, right? They say, wow, 3 more points than in 2012 when no campaign for uncommitted was mounted against Obama. So keep in mind, this campaign, as he calls it here, to vote uncommitted, it's only been a couple weeks. This was not some well-funded, months-long mission to sabotage Joe Biden. This was like an impromptu thing that was a grassroots movement where people were so fed up with his handling of Israel and Gaza that they decided to go out and do this. It built up momentum, and then they ended up getting over 100,000 votes, right? So to take this at face value, right, as pointed out here by Aaron Blake, comparing this to 2012, the uncommitted vote against Barack Obama running as an incumbent, right? So we have all of these different states. Michigan is the one to really compare it to. The uncommitted vote got 11%. Now, you may look at that and then compare it to this 13.2% and say, wow, that's not that much of a difference. So is this really a big deal at all? Well, a couple of different things here. First off, as was pointed out by the same person who he screenshotted here, although it looks like he forgot to look at the tweet that was directly below the one that he took a screenshot of. As pointed out here, one of the main differences is that back in 2012, there wasn't any other candidate on the ballot. So people didn't have the opportunity to do a protest vote like they did here, 42,000 of them, which ended up doing it, for Dean Phillips or Marianne Williamson. So that's another massive chunk there that was not included, in this count that, when doing a comparison to 2012. But another thing that I think is almost more important to point out about these numbers is that in 2012, the total uncommitted vote was 20,000. In this one, in 2024, we're talking about 100,000 people who voted uncommitted. So it's not comparable in terms of the total amount or in terms of the share of the electorate that Joe Biden needs to win in November. This is a massive deal. Anybody pretending like this isn't a big deal is out of their goddamn minds. And I guarantee you guys that the same people who are coming out right now, okay, mark my words, bookmark this video, whatever you want to do, the same people who are coming out now and saying that 100,000 people voting uncommitted is not a big deal, or that it shouldn't be too concerning for Joe Biden in 2024. Those are going to be the same exact people who go out and blame the same exact voters who voted uncommitted to protest his handling of Israel, and they're going to turn around and they're going to blame them, the voters, when Joe Biden loses to Trump in Michigan. Okay? That's what's going to happen. All right? And you shouldn't take that when that happens, because Joe Biden is now getting this warning. He's getting a firm warning from the people of Michigan. Hey, man, this is going to fuck up your chances in 2024. If he doesn't listen to that warning, if he doesn't drastically change policy course, right, immediately and drastically, then this is on his shoulders. Point blank, period. And so we move on to this as well. I mean, just another example of a similar vein of denial here. I mean, Politico said presidential aides continue to believe that today's uncommitted voters will be November's Biden voters. Once they have a stark choice in front of them between Biden and Trump. So that's the strategy, guys. It's just Trump bad. Hey, did you guys forget about Trump? You remember that Trump is bad? Yeah, we all know that. Everybody knows that Trump is bad. We all lived through 4 years of him as a president. We know what he's running on. We know that Donald Trump is not some pro-Palestine advocate. We know that he's not going to be better on Israel or Gaza or the Palestinian cause for that matter. Everybody understands that. That's not what this is about. You can't go and actively arm and support and defend a genocide and then turn around and say, but that guy's worse. Even if he is worse, marginal, on an issue like Israel. And on many other issues as well, even if he is worse, when you're supporting a genocide, believe it or not, that's not a very convincing argument to people, right? Especially many people who have family members or friends or loved ones that are being killed by Joe Biden's weapons that he's sending to Israel. So, I mean, it's just, again, just utter head in the sand delusion here. Now, I want to move on to this. So this was an absolutely wild CNN panel that was going viral last night, where we had the great Nina Turner on, and she's on a panel with a bunch of other like Democratic Party foot soldiers here, and they're basically just going to launch an all-out assault on her and attack her for bringing up the suffering of the people of Gaza, as if that's not relevant to the uncommitted vote in Michigan, right? So let's go ahead and watch our way through this.
Able to reel off these successes, then to not, the White House is listening to that message, but this is, if he's able to reel off these successes, then tonight actually will be a success for all, and you'll have a different outcome come November, because I'll pass it to Nina or whomever can help me understand this, but I don't think for many voters who are voting uncommitted that they're going to vote uncommitted and then say Donald Trump is my choice. I think this is more complicated than that.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Bakari. I mean, no one that I interface with said that they wanted to vote for Donald J. Trump. There is a however here. And I think sometimes as we talk about this issue, we're centering President Biden. We are centering former President Donald J. Trump, when the uncommitted effort is to center the people closest to the pain. And that is the Arab American community. That is the Palestinian community. That is communities that care about peace. And so while this president was in the ice cream shop saying, I think there's going to be a ceasefire, 30,000 people have been slaughtered. People are living in famine. They can't get medical care, so it can't come soon enough for them. And that was really the weight that I picked up on when I was in Dearborn. So we get to be comfortable and talk about this like these people are widgets when they are in fact suffering. And I am young enough to remember, colleagues, when Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and also Congresswoman Cori Bush called for a ceasefire very early on. They were called abhorrent. Now, fast forward to all of these bodies laying in the wake and people who are living through this every single day.
So by the way, there's also been slaughter in Israel.
I was going to say.
So there's a lot of pain on both sides.
No,
I'm not really need a lecture on the problem, but I'm talking about the politics of this tonight. how...
Okay, so we're going to continue here. Couple of different things. What Anderson just said there at the end, that we don't need a lecture on the substance of this issue, right? Or the policy of this issue. We just want to talk about the politics of it. What the hell are you talking about, man? The idea that you can separate the politics or the horse race of this discussion from the policy and the substance of the suffering that Biden is enabling inside of Gaza is delusional. How are you going to have a conversation where you're trying to analyze this 100,000 uncommitted vote to specifically protest a specific policy from the Biden administration and not talk about the reason why people cast this vote? How are you going to have that conversation? Of course you need to talk about the issue. Of course you need to talk about the substance. That's basically all that you should be talking about right now. But they just want to have this surface level conversation. Well, when are these people going to come back around? Because they're going to realize that Trump is so bad, right? That's all the conversation that they want to have. And so it's uncomfortable for them to talk about how their own party is complicit with the mass slaughter of innocent men, women, and children, okay? Or the starving of hundreds of thousands of people. It's uncomfortable for them to have that conversation. That's the conversation Nina's trying to get them to have, which would be productive, not just from a policy analysis perspective, but also from a political perspective. Because you can't unentwine those things, or whatever the phrase would be, right? They are incredibly intertwined, is what I'm saying. You can't separate the policy from the politics on an issue like this. It is as black and white, as clear as it could possibly be, of a message that the voters were sending as a part of this election. I mean, again, going back to what Bakari was saying at the beginning of this clip, that, well, I don't think that these people are going to switch to Donald Trump, and so it's a complex analysis going into November. Yeah, I mean, it is somewhat complex, I guess. There are many different people with nuanced different perspectives on this. Some of them are winnable, if Joe Biden drastically changes course. Some of them are not. But of course they're not going to go vote for Donald Trump. That's not the issue. The issue is, are they going to vote third party, or are they going to stay home? That's the issue for Joe Biden. And it's like they're incapable of having a real conversation or a real analysis of that. And the most ironic part about it is that Nina Turner said at the beginning of what her statement was here, that it's easy for us, meaning the people who are sitting on this panel right there, comfy in some $1 million studio talking about this, it's easy for them to talk about these people as if they're just widgets, right? Is the word that she used there, right? As if they're just like chess pawns to be moved around on this game between Democratic and Republican establishment figures for who gets to to group them up for November to keep themselves in power. You're talking about them as if they're not real people, or as if they aren't going through anything right now. You should be talking about the substance. You should be talking about the suffering. That's the only way you're ever going to get a real perspective on why people decided to do this in the first place, and why this is going to have massive ramifications for the 2024 November election. But he has a follow-up question here. So let's go ahead and listen to this and see what Nina's response is.
What to you would be a victory, as somebody was calling for this uncommitted vote, what to you would be a victory tonight to get that message across?
I'm not denying that pain. All I'm saying that at a certain point after October the 7th, it becomes clear. I mean, you have a right-wing prime minister.
Right. We don't need to debate the issue.
But you understand what I'm saying? I'm not denying anybody's pain. What I am saying is that this president and our country has the power to say to Netanyahu, we need a permanent ceasefire. The only time hostages...
Within reason, though, if I can push back here...
Wait, one more point. The only time hostages were released is when we had that brief ceasefire. That is another reason why we need a permanent ceasefire.
I also have to remind people we had a ceasefire prior to October 7th.
Yeah.
Okay. So we got to end it off there, guys. I don't know if I could take any more of this anyways. The idea that there was a ceasefire in place before October 7th is utterly detached from reality. This is how you know that the people sitting at this panel right here, except for Nina Turner, that they have no ability to do a structural analysis or an honest analysis of what Israel is and has been doing to the Palestinians for decades now. 2023, before October 7th, was the deadliest year in the West Bank for Palestinians in modern history, okay? So I guess if your definition of a ceasefire is a continued illegal occupation and apartheid and an ethnic cleansing and the expansion of illegal settlements into Palestinian territories, if that's your definition of a ceasefire, then sure, there was a ceasefire. But that's not my definition of a ceasefire. That is continued systemic violence that Israel is wielding against the Palestinians. But they don't seem to have the capacity to analyze structural state violence. They think violence can only exist in one way. So what Hamas did on October 7th, that was violence, that was terrorism, but Israel going into Gaza and displacing 90% of the population, starving hundreds of thousands of them, killing a vast majority innocent men, women, and children, okay, destroying hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, everything you could possibly imagine, that's not unnecessary violence. That's not terrorism. Because Israel is good. They are a democracy. They are our allies, right? And they spin themselves up into this narrative as if state violence cannot be terrorism. State violence cannot be unnecessary or criminal, right? And it's completely detached from reality. Not just the reality of like the consequences on the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, but it's detached from reality in the sense of like international law, straight up, right? This is why Israel is facing an ICJ case for genocide that the ICJ already ruled was plausible that they were committing, as South Africa brought that case. And so, I mean, there's so much to say about this, right? I mean, even just Anderson Cooper responding to Nina Turner twice, basically saying the same thing. The second time he said, well, they were suffering on both sides, right? They were suffering on the Israeli side on October 7th, and they're suffering on the Palestinian side, and so it's kind of a wash. You know, why even talk about the substance of what's happening, right? That's kind of his response there. And it's wild to me, because on the one hand, like, sure, yeah, you could have a conversation in an isolated way about October 7th. There were innocent civilians who were killed. There were war crimes that were committed. There are people who are never going to be the same for the rest of their lives who were impacted by that. It's fine to bring that up, but to equate that after Israel has killed over 40 times the amount of civilians in the 5 months since October 7th, in that period, we have seen essentially just a completely one-sided mass slaughter of civilians. To say, well, they're suffering on both sides, okay, what are you trying to say? That these are equivalent? They're not. They're not equivalent in the total amount of civilians who have been killed. They're certainly not equivalent in terms of civilian infrastructure that has been destroyed. They're not equivalent in the terms of military power. Hamas is a militia, essentially, and Israel is one of the most powerful militaries in the region that is backed up by the single most powerful military in the world that has been flattening Gaza for 5 months now. To pretend as if these are comparable things is utterly absurd, and you're also removing them from the historical context of the oppression that Israel has waged against the Palestinian people for decades and decades and decades. And they just cannot have that conversation. They're incapable of having that conversation. So, I mean, shout out to Nina Turner for keeping her cool on that panel. I don't think that I would have been able to do that, but, you know, I think she said what she needed to say, and the rest of the people on the panel just straight up embarrassed themselves, okay? Now, just real quick before I finish off this video here, I did have to mention that Marianne Williamson re-entered the race. She unsuspended her campaign. Now, to be honest, guys, I mean, I watched this video. I'll link it down below if you want to go watch it yourself. I don't know why she's doing this. I guess maybe she saw the Uncommitted vote success in Michigan, and she decided maybe there's an opportunity on Super Tuesday or something to get some delegates or to re-enter the race and try to change the dynamic in some way. I think I could see an argument for that if you were going to re-enter the race and say, I am the ceasefire candidate. I'm making this my primary issue that I'm running on. Joe Biden is in the pocket of Israel. He's letting them do whatever they want. He is enabling a genocide. I am against all of that. I will bring it to a halt. Vote for me instead of voting uncommitted, right? I could see that kind of an argument being made. But I watched through this video, guys, and you know, of course I agree with Marianne Williamson more than anybody else who's in the race right now on policy, right? And she talks about all of that. She talks about the economy and healthcare and all of that good stuff, right? But she doesn't really get into the Israel-Gaza stuff as much as she should be, if at all. I don't think she mentioned it in this video, or maybe she did just temporarily. So I don't really understand if you're just re-entering it to run the same campaign that was not really successful, unfortunately, because the deck is completely stacked against her, then I don't really know what this is for, right? And so we'll see what happens from here, guys. You know, obviously, again, love Marianne. We'll see how it goes from here. I think you should focus heavily on a ceasefire and making yourself, you know, the biggest critic of Israel and the biggest supporter for a ceasefire and the Palestinian cause, if that's the route that you want to go. But in terms of whether or not the uncommitted vote is going to have an impact on Biden, I don't know if it will. I really don't know if it will. I think it definitely sends a message. The question is whether or not that message is going to be received. And if, you know, what we've seen so far is an indicator of what's going to come in the future, then it's probably not going to have much of an impact on his policy. But even if it doesn't have a direct impact on shifting him in the right direction on Israel and Gaza, it certainly will have an impact in November. And this is one of those things where, regardless of how delusional Democrats want to be, regardless of how delusional their campaign strategy is or their denial of reality on 100,000 people voting uncommitted, showing up to the polls to vote against a specific policy that Biden is enabling right now, regardless of how delusional they are, this is going to have a major impact. And so we'll have to see how this plays out because, again, this isn't his only issue in these swing states. It's not the only one. This is a major one, but he has a whole bunch of other things to worry about as well. And so the question is, like, you have this historically weak candidate, one of the weakest in modern history in the United States. Are you going to stick with this guy? Are you really not going to change any of your major policy? Are you not going to change your campaign strategy in any way, shape, or form as you are down in the polls in every single major swing state? You're just going to continue on the trajectory that you're on right now? I mean, if that's the case, then good fucking luck. When you lose in November, don't come back crying and don't come back, blaming the voters who voted uncommitted. They tried to send you a warning shot. This is it. This is the moment. Are you going to listen? I guess we'll see.